The dust of the plains was a language Royce understood. It spoke of drought, of distance, of the crushing, indifferent weight of the sky. For 5 years, since the silence had first fallen over his cabin, the dust had been his only constant companion. It settled on the rim of his coffee cup, coated the unused chair at his table, and ghosted across the window panes like a cataract on an old man's eye. He'd sent the letter to the matrimonial courier out of a desperation so profound it felt more like a physical ache than an emotion. He hadn't asked for love or even companionship. He had asked for a presence, a sound other than the wind and his own heartbeat. He had asked for a wife. The stagecoach was a dark smear on the horizon long before he could hear the jangle of its harness. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets, a posture he hoped conveyed a casual indifference he did not feel. He had cleaned the cabin, aired out the spare room, and even purchased a small, tin-framed mirror from the general store in Dusty Redemption, a town that had long since given up on the promise of its name. He was prepared for a woman who was plain, or perhaps stern. He was prepared for someone fleeing a past, or chasing a future that existed only in the fanciful prose of the courier's advertisements. He was prepared for everything he could imagine. He was not prepared for what happened next. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt, the driver a silhouette against the blinding afternoon sun. The man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, not even bothering to look Royce in the eye. He grunted, gestured with his thumb toward the passenger door, and began unstrapping a single, modest trunk from the rear. Royce's gaze fixed on the door as it swung open. Dust settled, and then 2 women stepped down from the wagon, connected at the neck by a thick, seamless bridge of flesh and bone. The world, for a moment, went utterly silent. The wind died, the buzzing of the flies ceased. Royce's breath caught in his throat, a hard knot of disbelief. They moved as one, a fluid, practiced motion that was both graceful and deeply unsettling. One woman, the one on the left, had a face set in lines of grim determination. Her chin was high, her dark eyes scanning the barren landscape of his ranch with a pragmatic, almost appraising look. The other, her mirror image in form but not in spirit, kept her head bowed, a curtain of dark hair obscuring her features. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white, their heads turned in perfect, unnerving coordination to look at him. The driver heaved their trunk to the ground with a thud that broke the spell. "That'll be the fare," he mumbled, his eyes darting everywhere but at his passengers. Royce, still frozen, reached into his pocket and produced the coins, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. The driver snatched them, clambered back onto his seat, and cracked his whip. The stagecoach lurched away, leaving a roiling cloud of dust and an impossible reality standing in Royce's front yard. The woman on the left took a step forward, a movement that pulled her sister along with her. "Mr. Royce?" she asked. Her voice was clear and steady, devoid of apology or preamble. Royce could only nod, his throat too tight for words. "I am Clara," she said, her gaze direct and unflinching. "This is my sister, Violet. We answered your advertisement." He finally found his voice, though it came out as a rough croak. "The letter, it spoke of one woman, a widow named Elspeth." Clara's expression didn't change. It was a mask of stoic resolve. "Elspeth couldn't make the journey. She asked us to come in her stead. The arrangement is the same. The arrangement, marriage." The word was a grotesque absurdity in this context. He looked from Clara's defiant face to the top of Violet's bowed head, and then to the place where their bodies joined. It was a solid, undeniable fact, a piece of anatomy that defied every law of nature he understood. He felt a wave of something hot and suffocating. Not anger, but a profound, disorienting confusion. This was not a wife. This was a phenomenon, a secret that had been delivered to his doorstep. I don't understand," he stammered, the words feeling inadequate and foolish. "There isn't much to understand," Clara stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We are here. We are capable. We can cook, clean, mend. We will earn our keep, She spoke of the union as a business transaction, stripping it of all the terrifying intimacy he had been steeling himself for. Violet, the silent sister, finally lifted her head. Her eyes, when they met his, were filled with a liquid terror so deep it was like looking into a well. She flinched as if expecting a blow, her hand instinctively reaching up to clutch at Clara's arm. In that single, desperate gesture, Royce saw more than Clara's pragmatic words could ever convey. He saw shame. He saw fear. He saw a lifetime of recoiling from the horrified stares of the world. And in that moment Royce, the man who had walled himself off from all human connection, felt the first unwelcome crack in his solitude. He looked at the vast, empty prairie stretching out behind them, a wilderness that could swallow a person whole. He thought of the departing stagecoach, their only link to a world that had clearly cast them out. He could tell them to go. He could leave them standing in the dust. But where would they go? He drew a long, ragged breath, the dry air burning his lungs. "The cabin's small," he said, the words tasting like grit and resignation. "You'll have to share the spare room." Clara nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "We are accustomed to it." Violet's shoulders relaxed by a fraction, a barely perceptible change. But Royce saw it. He turned without another word and walked toward the cabin, his mind a maelstrom of questions without answers. He did not know what he had gotten himself into. He only knew that the silence he had so desperately sought to fill had just been replaced by a mystery far deeper and more complex than he could ever have imagined. The dust settled around their feet, three figures bound together by a contract, a secret, and the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the land. The first days were a study in awkward mechanics and suffocating silence. Royce's cabin, which had always felt spacious in its emptiness, now seemed impossibly small, a cramped stage for a bizarre play. Every movement was a negotiation. Getting through a doorway required the sisters to turn sideways, a synchronized shuffle that was both elegant and tragic. Royce found himself holding his breath as they navigated the narrow space between the table and the stove, their shared body a constant, physical reminder of the strangeness of his new reality. He had given them the spare room, a small space he'd built for a child he never had. The single bed was useless. They slept on a pallet of blankets on the floor, and in the dead of night, he could sometimes hear them murmuring to each other, a low, private language that made him feel like an intruder in his own home. He would lie awake on his cot, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, and wonder if he had gone mad. He had invited a ghost into his house, a living, breathing specter of a life he couldn't comprehend. Clara was the voice. She was relentlessly practical. On the second morning, she stood before him, Violet a silent appendage at her side, and laid out their terms with the cool precision of a banker. "We will handle the household chores, cooking, cleaning, mending. We see your garden is in need of tending. We are strong. We can help with that. We require only food and shelter." Nothing more. She did not speak of the marriage contract. It hung in the air between them, an unspoken, unignorable fact. Royce, for his part, retreated into the familiar rhythms of his work. He spent his days out on the range, checking his fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, seeking solace in the physical exertion and the immense, indifferent landscape. But he could not escape them. Their presence lingered in the cabin. The smell of baking bread, a scent he hadn't known in 5 years, now met him at the door. His worn shirts were patched with neat, almost invisible stitches. The perpetual layer of dust was gone, replaced by a cleanliness that felt alien and accusatory. He watched them from a distance. He saw the incredible, intricate dance of their cooperation. When they weeded the garden, one would kneel, her hands clearing the soil, while the other remained standing, a sentinel, her hands ready to receive the discarded weeds. When they kneaded dough, for hands worked in perfect unison, a mesmerizing display of shared purpose. He began to see the subtle differences he had missed in his initial shock. Clara's movements were sharp, efficient. Violet's were softer, more hesitant. Clara's face was a mask of fortitude, Violet's was a canvas of transparent emotion, flinching at the slightest unexpected sound, her eyes constantly scanning his face for disapproval. One evening, he came in from the barn, weary to the bone, and found Violet sitting alone on the porch steps, or as alone as she could ever be. Clara was standing beside her, staring out at the blood-red sunset, a silent guard. Violet was sketching in the dirt with a stick, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was drawing a horse, a creature of impossible grace and freedom, its lines swift and certain. When she heard his footsteps, she startled violently, her foot reflexively smudging the drawing into nothing. She bowed her head, her body rigid with shame, as if he had caught her in some terrible transgression. "It was good," Royce said, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet air. Violet didn't look up. Clara answered for her. "She has a good eye. Let her speak for herself," Royce said, more harshly than he intended. Clara's jaw tightened. "She does not like to speak to strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Royce countered, the absurdity of the statement hitting him as soon as he said it. "I live here. This is my home." He was their husband, in name if not in fact. The thought was a jolt. A tense silence descended. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange. Royce felt a familiar wave of frustration. He had sought to end his isolation, and instead, he had imported a new, more complicated kind of loneliness into the very heart of his home. These women were a fortress, their shared body the impenetrable wall, and he was on the outside. He sighed, the sound a ragged admission of defeat. "The stew smells good." He turned and went inside, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He ate his dinner in silence, the sisters taking their meal on the porch as they always did, refusing to sit at the table with him. The separation was a statement, a boundary he didn't know how to cross. Later that night, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to want to tear the world from its foundations. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the cabin shuddered with each blast. Royce sat at his table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern, the familiar, methodical task a comfort. Suddenly, a cry pierced the storm's roar, a thin, terrified sound from the spare room. It was followed by Clara's voice, low and urgent. Royce hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. In the flickering lantern light, he saw them on their pallet. Violet was thrashing, her eyes wide with a waking nightmare, her hands pushing against an unseen foe. "No," she was whimpering. "Please, don't let them look." Clara had her arms wrapped around her sister, a futile attempt to contain the terror. She was murmuring soothing words, but Violet's panic was too strong. "It's all right, Vi. We're safe. He's not here. He's always here," Violet sobbed, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I can feel their eyes, all of them, staring." Clara looked up and saw Royce standing in the doorway. Her face, usually so composed, was etched with exhaustion and a fierce, desperate protectiveness. For the first time, he saw not a pragmatic negotiator, but a sister terrified for the one person she could never leave. "Get out," Clara hissed, her voice low and venomous. Royce didn't move. He looked at Violet, who was now weeping silently, her face buried in Clara's shoulder. He saw the raw terror that she hid so carefully behind her curtain of hair and her downcast eyes. This wasn't just shyness. This was trauma. This was the deep, scarring wound left by 1,000 pairs of cruel, curious eyes. He was beginning to understand that their physical bond was the least complicated thing about them. The real chains were invisible, forged in a past he knew nothing about. He backed out of the room, pulling the door gently closed. He returned to his table, but the rifle felt cold and useless in his hands. The storm raged outside, but it was nothing compared to the tempest of questions now raging within him. Who were they running from? What had been done to them that could leave such a profound and lasting fear? He had accepted them onto his land out of a reluctant sense of duty, a pragmatic inability to turn them away. But listening to Violet's terrified sobs, something else began to stir within him. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in 5 years. A ghost of an instinct he thought had died with his wife and child. It was the urge to protect. And it was aimed at the two women in the next room, the conjoined strangers who were his brides. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain and sage. The fragile truce in the cabin, however, had been shattered. The secret of Violet's terror was out, lying between them like a loaded gun. Royce knew he could not go on pretending this was a simple arrangement of convenience. He was harboring more than just an anomaly. He was harboring a secret, and it was clear that secret had teeth. He waited 2 days, giving them space, letting the echoes of that night fade. He watched as the familiar masks were put back in place. Clara became even more brisk and efficient, her every action a wall against intrusion. Violet retreated further into herself, her eyes never leaving the ground, a walking embodiment of shame. The silence in the cabin grew heavier, thick with unspoken words. On the third evening, Royce made his decision. He couldn't live with the mystery, not when it screamed in the night. After their silent supper, as Clara and Violet were clearing the dishes, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Clara froze, a plate in her hand. Violet flinched, dropping a fork with a clatter. "There is nothing to talk about," Clara said, her back to him. "The other night," Royce pressed on, ignoring her dismissal. "The storm. What was that about? Who is he?" Clara turned slowly, her face a thundercloud. Violet shrank behind her, trying to make herself invisible. "It is none of your concern," Clara said, her voice dangerously low. "I made it my concern when I let you stay," Royce countered, his own anger rising to meet hers. "This is my ranch, my home. If you've brought trouble here, I have a right to know what it is. I have a right to know who I'm protecting you from." The word protecting hung in the air, changing the dynamic of the conversation. It was an admission. Clara's hard expression wavered for a fraction of a second. She looked at Violet, whose hands were trembling. A silent communication passed between them, a lifetime of shared thoughts conveyed in a single glance. With a weary sigh, Clara's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. "There's coffee on the stove," Royce said, his tone softening. He gestured to the chairs at the table. It was an invitation, a bridge across the chasm of their silence. Hesitantly, they came. It was the first time they had ever sat at his table. Royce poured 3 cups of coffee, the simple domestic act feeling monumental. He sat opposite them, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara took a deep breath, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "Our parents were poor farmers," she began, her voice flat, reciting a history she had clearly told before. "When we were born, they didn't know what to do. The doctor called us a monstrosity. The preacher said we were a punishment from God." She paused, her gaze distant. "When we were 10, a man came to the farm. He wore a fine suit and spoke with a smooth, convincing voice. He said he was a scientist and impresario. His name was Mr. Abernathy." Violet made a small, choked sound. Clara reached over, her hand covering her sister's. "He was the director of the Continental Curiosity Company," Clara continued, her voice laced with a venom she couldn't conceal. "He offered our parents a sum of money that could have bought them 10 farms. Fortune. For us, he promised we would be educated, cared for, that we would see the world. He said we would be celebrated for our unique nature." Royce listened, his gut tightening. He knew this kind of story. He'd seen the lurid posters in towns for traveling shows, promising 2-headed calves and bearded ladies. "He lied," Clara said, the words like chips of ice. "We weren't students. We were exhibits. He put us on a stage. The Orchid Sisters, he called us. He made us wear silk dresses and sit on a velvet settee while hundreds of people paid a dime to file past and stare. They would point. They would whisper. Some of them tried to touch us, to see if we were real." Violet began to weep silently, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Royce's hands clenched into fists under the table. Abernathy was a collector, Clara went on, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. He owned us. We were his prized possession. He kept us for 12 years. We never saw the sun, except through the grimy window of a train car. We never spoke to anyone who hadn't paid for the privilege of gaping at us. He was the one Violet fears in her dreams. He was our keeper, our jailer. She looked Royce directly in the eye, her own dark eyes burning with the intensity of her memory. 2 months ago, in St. Louis, there was a fire in the theater. In the chaos, we ran. We just ran. We had a little money we had managed to save, coins people would sometimes toss onto the stage. We found a woman, Elspeth, in a boarding house. She was kind. She was supposed to come here to you, but her brother fell ill. We paid her the last of our money to let us take her place. We just wanted to go somewhere no one would ever think to look. A place so remote, so empty, that we could finally be invisible. The story settled in the small cabin, a horrifying weight. Royce finally understood. The downcast eyes, the flinching, the nightmares. It was the result of a dozen years of being treated as less than human, of being a thing to be stared at. His ranch wasn't just a refuge. It was the only place on earth they might be safe. He will look for you, Royce said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, her face grim. Mr. Abernathy does not part with his collection easily. He considers us his property. He will have sent men. Now Royce understood the true stakes of his decision. He wasn't just a reluctant husband, he was a shield. He was the only thing standing between these two terrified women and the man who saw them as a commodity. His quiet, empty life was over. He had inadvertently stepped into their war. He looked from Clara's fierce, defiant face to Violet's tear-streaked one. The fear he had felt in the beginning, the fear of their strangeness, of the complication they represented, was gone. It had been burned away and replaced by a cold, hard resolve. These men, these bounty hunters for human souls, would not find an easy target here. They would find him. Let them come, Royce said, his voice a low growl. This is my land. No one takes anything from my land. In that moment, the contract between them was rewritten. It was no longer about a mail-order bride arrangement. It was an alliance, forged in the telling of a painful truth and sealed by a shared threat. For the first time, when he looked at them, he didn't see an oddity. He saw 2 women, Clara and Violet, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would die before he let anyone drag them back into the dark. The confession changed the air in the cabin. The heavy silence of secrets was replaced by the tense quiet of a shared purpose. An invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer 3 separate, isolated people living under one roof. They were a unit, a garrison of 3 against a world that had proven its cruelty. Royce's days took on a new, sharper focus. His work on the ranch was no longer a retreat from loneliness, but a mission to fortify their sanctuary. He checked the sight on his rifle not as a chore, but as a necessary preparation. Every distant dust cloud on the horizon was a potential threat, every snap of a twig in the night a possible intruder. His relationship with the sisters transformed. He began speaking to them not out of necessity, but out of a genuine desire to know them as individuals. He learned that Clara, for all her stoicism, had a dry, understated wit. She also possessed a keen mind for strategy, quickly grasping the layout of the land and pointing out the most defensible positions around the cabin. She was the general, the shield. Violet remained the fragile heart of their small trio, but with the secret of her past now shared, she began to emerge from her shell, petal by delicate petal. Royce made a point of speaking to her directly, asking her simple questions that required more than a nod or a shake of the head. He asked her what she thought of the sunrise, or which of the wildflowers that grew near the creek she found prettiest. At first, her answers were whispered, almost inaudible, filtered through Clara's protective presence. But slowly, she began to find her own voice. One afternoon, he found her again sketching in the dirt near the porch. This time, she didn't erase the image when he approached. It was a detailed drawing of his face, surprisingly accurate, capturing the weariness in his eyes but also a kindness he hadn't known was there. "You have a gift," he said softly, careful not to startle her. She looked up, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Mr. Abernathy, he didn't like it when I drew. He said it was a waste of my hands." "He was a fool," Royce said, the words coming out with a rough certainty. He went into the cabin and returned with a few sheets of precious paper and a nub of charcoal he used for marking lumber. He placed them in her hand. "Don't use the dirt. Use this. What you make is worth keeping." Violet's eyes widened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she gave him a small, genuine smile. It was a revelation, a flicker of light in the deep well of her sadness. Clara, standing nearby, watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, but Royce saw the tension in her shoulders ease. It was an approval, a quiet acknowledgement of his gesture. He decided they could not be defenseless. Fear was a poison, and the only antidote was preparedness. He took them out to the edge of his property, to a small ravine where he practiced his shooting. He set up a line of tin cans on a fallen log. "You need to know how to use this," he said, holding out his spare pistol, a heavy Colt revolver. Clara took it without hesitation, her hand steady. "I've never held a gun before." "It's time you learned," Royce said. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her arm, how to aim down the sight. Violet watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Clara's first shot went wide, kicking up a cloud of dust. But she was a quick study. She listened to his instructions, adjusted her stance, and fired again. The second shot sent a can spinning into the air. A grim smile touched her lips. "Now you," he said, looking at Violet. Violet shook her head, shrinking back. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Royce said firmly. "Fear is their weapon. Don't let them have it." Clara spoke, her voice gentle. "Together, Vi. Like always." Clara kept her left hand on the pistol's grip, and Violet placed her right hand over Clara's, her slender fingers steadying the heavy barrel. Their bodies, once a source of shame and spectacle, became a point of strength, a stable, unified platform. Royce watched, struck by the image. They were two people, but in this they were one. He helped them adjust their aim. "Breathe out slow," he instructed. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." They fired. The shot was true, another can leaping from the log. A look of stunned surprise passed over Violet's face, quickly followed by a flicker of pride. They spent the rest of the afternoon practicing, their confidence growing with every successful shot. Royce saw a new light in their eyes. They were no longer just fugitives hiding from the world. They were survivors learning to fight for their freedom. The intimacy between the three of them deepened in the quiet moments. They began to eat their meals together at the table. The conversations were still sparse, but comfortable. He told them about his wife, Sarah, and the fever that had taken her and their infant son 5 years ago. He spoke of how the silence of the cabin had become a living thing, a weight that had been crushing him. "It's not silent anymore," Clara observed quietly one evening, and he knew she was right. Their presence, once so jarring, had become the new sound of his life, a sound of soft footsteps, quiet murmurs, and the scratch of charcoal on paper. One night he found he couldn't sleep. He stepped out onto the porch for some air. The moon was full, bathing the prairie in a stark, silver light. He saw them standing by the fence, looking up at the vast, star-dusted sky. He walked over, his boots silent in the soft dirt. "It's beautiful," Violet whispered, not to him, but to the night itself. "We never got to see the stars. The city lights were too bright." They stood there for a long time, the three of them in a comfortable silence. The initial awkwardness and suspicion had long since melted away, forged by shared secrets and mutual respect into a bond of necessity. But standing there, under the immense, silent canopy of the night sky, Royce realized it had become something more. He looked at Clara's strong profile, a bastion of defiance, and at Violet's face, turned up to the moonlight with a look of childlike wonder. He felt a strange, fierce affection for them, a protective instinct that went beyond mere duty. He had sent for one wife to fill a void in his life, and in their place, fate had sent him two halves of a single, resilient soul. He was no longer just their protector. He was beginning to feel like their partner. The thought didn't scare him anymore. Felt like coming home. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Royce knew it couldn't last. For a month, they lived in a state of heightened awareness, a strange domesticity punctuated by the ever-present threat. Then, one morning, the threat arrived. Royce saw them first, two riders approaching from the east. They weren't cowboys or drifters. They rode expensive, well-groomed horses, and their clothes were dark and tailored, out of place in the rugged landscape. They moved with a relaxed, confident air that was more menacing than any open display of aggression. Royce's blood ran cold. He had been expecting them, but the reality of their arrival was a punch to the gut. He stepped back inside the cabin, his movements calm and deliberate. "They're here," he said, his voice low. The effect was instantaneous. Violet let out a small gasp, her face draining of all color. Clara's expression hardened into a mask of pure defiance. She moved to the window, peering through the edge of the curtain. "Two of them," she confirmed, her voice tight. "Well-dressed. They look like city men." "They are," Royce said, taking his rifle from its rack above the door. He checked the load. "They're bounty hunters. Professionals." He looked at the sisters. The terror in Violet's eyes was a physical thing, but Clara stood her ground, her hand protectively on her sister's arm. "Get the pistol," Royce commanded. "Stay away from the windows. Don't come out unless I call you." Clara nodded, her eyes locking with his. An unspoken understanding passed between them. This was the moment they had been preparing for. She guided a trembling Violet to the back of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows of their room. Royce stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. He watched as the two men rode into his yard and dismounted, their movements fluid and practiced. The taller of the two, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and cold, gray eyes, smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Mr. Royce?" the man asked, his voice polite, cultured. It was the kind of voice Mr. Abernathy probably had. "My name is Mr. Gable. This is my associate, Mr. Finch. We have business with you." "I don't have any business with you," Royce said, his thumb resting on the hammer of his rifle. Gable's smile didn't falter. He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "We believe you are harboring property belonging to our employer, the Continental Curiosity Company." Two women. A rather unique specimen. The word specimen was like a lit match dropped on dry tinder. Royce's grip on the rifle tightened. "There's no one here but me," Royce lied, his voice flat. Finch, a shorter, broader man, chuckled. "We've been tracking them since St. Louis. They aren't ghosts. We know they're here." The stagecoach driver in Redemption was quite talkative, for the right price. Gable took a step forward, his hand reaching inside his coat. He pulled out a thick leather wallet. "Our employer is a reasonable man. He is prepared to be generous for the safe return of his investment. $500. A handsome sum for a man in your position. Just hand them over and we will be on our way. No trouble." $500. More money than Royce saw in a year. He thought of Clara's fierce pride, of Violet's terrified sobs in the night, of her small, rare smile when he'd given her the drawing paper. He thought of her calling them a specimen. "They're not property," Royce said, his voice a low growl. "And this is my land. Now get off it." Gable's polite facade finally cracked. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold annoyance. "I believe you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Royce. This is not a request," he nodded at Finch. Events accelerated with terrifying speed. Finch's hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. But Royce was ready. He had been born and raised in a land where a moment's hesitation was the difference between life and death. He brought the rifle to his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. The world narrowed to the space between his front sight and Finch's chest. He fired. The rifle's roar shattered the morning quiet. Finch was thrown backward, a dark stain blossoming on his white shirt, his own shot going wild into the dirt. Gable was faster. His pistol was already out, spitting fire. A bullet splintered the porch post next to Royce's head, showering him with wood chips. Royce dropped to a crouch, levering another round into the chamber as he moved. He fired again, but Gable had already dove for the cover of the water trough. Gunpowder mixed with the smell of the morning air. Royce knew he was in a bad position. He was exposed on the porch. Gable was a professional, patient, and deadly. He would wait for a clean shot. Then, a sound came from inside the cabin. The back door, which led out from the sisters' room, creaked open. Royce risked a glance. He saw them, framed in the doorway, just as they had practiced. Clara held the Colt pistol in a two-handed grip, and Violet's hands were clasped over hers, steadying the weapon against the doorframe. Their two faces were a mask of unified concentration, their four eyes focused on the man hiding behind the trough. They had become the stable firing platform he had taught them to be. Gable, focused on Royce, didn't see them. He rose slightly from his cover, trying to get a better angle. It was the opening they needed. The Colt barked, a sharper sound than the rifle's boom. Gable cried out, stumbling back, his hand clutching his shoulder. He stared at the cabin in disbelief, his eyes finding the source of the unexpected shot. He saw the two women, the prize he had come to collect, holding the gun that had wounded him. His face contorted in a mask of fury. He raised his pistol, ignoring his wound, his intent clear. He would kill his property before letting it escape. Royce saw the movement. He stood, exposing himself completely, and fired the rifle one last time. The shot was true. Gable collapsed, his pistol falling from his lifeless hand into the dust. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The only sound was the ringing in Royce's ears and the frantic beating of his own heart. He looked at the two bodies in his yard, then back at the cabin. Clara and Violet were still standing in the doorway, the pistol smoking in their hands, their faces pale with shock but resolute. They had not been victims. They had fought back. They had defended their home, their sanctuary. Royce felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. The battle was over. They had won. The aftermath of the violence was a quiet, grim affair. The sun climbed higher, baking the dusty yard where two men lay dead. There was no sense of triumph, only a heavy, sobering finality. Royce, Clara, and Violet worked together in near silence, a well-oiled machine born of necessity. They dragged the bodies to the far edge of the property, to a rocky wash where the buzzards would be the only mourners. They buried them in shallow graves, a task that was brutal and dehumanizing, but necessary. They erased the signs of the gunfight, scattering fresh dirt over the bloodstains, collecting the spent cartridges. Royce's wounded horse was tended to, the bounty hunter's fine animals stripped of their saddles and turned loose on the prairie. By midday, it was as if Gable and Finch had never existed. But something had irrevocably changed. The threat that had haunted them was gone, eliminated in a storm of gunpowder and desperation. In its place was a new, unbreakable bond, cemented by the shared trauma and the visceral act of survival. That evening, they sat at the table, the silence no longer tense, but restorative. Royce looked at the two women who had turned his world upside down. He saw the exhaustion in Clara's face, but also a new, hard-won confidence. He saw the lingering fear in Violet's eyes, but it was overshadowed by a flicker of strength he had never seen before. They were not the same women who had stepped off that stagecoach weeks ago, and he was not the same man. "It's over," he said, the words feeling both true and inadequate. Clara nodded. "For now. Abernathy will send others when these two don't return." "Let him," Royce said, his voice firm. "We'll be ready. This is your home now. No one will ever take you from it." He looked from one to the other, seeing them not as a unit, but as two distinct, remarkable individuals to whom he was inextricably bound. The mail-order contract, it was a lie, a means to an end. Yes, Clara agreed, her gaze steady. I want to make it real, Royce said, the words surprising him as much as them. Not the arrangement we had. Something new. A real marriage. To both of you. Partnership. Family. If you'll have me. Violet's head shot up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Clara stared at him, her usual composure faltering. She seemed to be searching his face for any sign of pity or obligation. She found none. She saw only a raw, honest sincerity. She looked at Violet, a silent question passing between them. Violet gave the slightest of nods, a tear tracing a clean path down her dusty cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of relief, of acceptance. Clara turned back to Royce. We would be honored, she said, her voice thick with an emotion he had never heard from her before. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm. The constant vigilance was replaced by a peaceful industry. They expanded the garden, repaired the barn, and worked side by side, their 3 lives braided into one. Royce taught Violet to ride, finding a gentle mare that she could manage. He watched, his heart aching with a quiet joy, as she and Clara rode out across the plains, their laughter carrying on the wind. They were no longer confined to the cabin. The entire ranch was their kingdom. Violet's art flourished. The cabin walls, once bare, were now filled with her charcoal sketches of prairie life. A hawk on the wing, the cattle at dusk, Royce's hands, calloused and strong, mending a fence. He discovered the profound and complex nature of their love. He loved Clara for her strength, her sharp mind, and the fierce loyalty that burned behind her guarded eyes. He loved Violet for her gentleness, her artistic soul, and the incredible resilience that allowed her to find beauty in a world that had shown her so much ugliness. And they, in turn, loved him. They loved him for seeing them, for fighting for them, for giving them a home not just on his land, but in his heart. Their nights were a quiet intimacy he had never imagined. They would sit on the porch, watching the stars Violet had been denied for so long. Sometimes he would read to them from an old, worn book. Other times they would just sit in a comfortable silence, the bond between them needing no words. He had sought a wife to cure his loneliness, and in return, he had been given a love so unique, so complete, it defied all conventional understanding. He had found his family in the most impossible of circumstances. Years passed. The threat of Mr. Abernathy and his Curiosity Company faded into a distant memory, a ghost story they sometimes told to remind themselves of how far they had come. The ranch thrived, and so did they. Royce, Clara, and Violet had built more than just a sanctuary. They had built a life, a testament to the fact that love could grow in the most barren of soil, in forms that defied all expectation. They were 3 parts of a whole, their strange and wonderful union a quiet triumph against the cruelty of the world. The haunted rancher was haunted no more. His ghosts banished by the love of the conjoined brides he had never expected, but had been destined to find. Their story is a powerful reminder of how acceptance and love can be found in the most unexpected forms. If their journey from isolation to family resonated with you, please consider sharing this story with others who appreciate tales of resilience, found family, and the unconventional paths to happiness. Your support helps bring more unique stories like this to life.